There we go. So we're gonna have a nice little intro. So yeah, so today we're gonna have a talk from Hugh about sort of Jack's NumPyro and samplers, all the work he's done on it. He's done some really amazing stuff. Not quite in optics, more focused on galaxy stuff, if I'm not mistaken.
Quasars, yeah.
Cool, awesome, yeah. And solving some really hard problems with not very nice posteriors and how we can use advanced MCMC methods to find some cool solutions. So, yeah, with that intro, Hugh, please take us away.
All right, let me just throw this out. So I put this together more as a very introductory overview of the MCMC sampler that you have access to in NumPyro, rather than a specific discussion of my work, which actually usually goes away from using these samplers and looks at different methods of calculating the posterior without MCMC. Uh, like my current work is on using scan and then a Laplace approximation integral to fit the posterior for the delay uh, in the delay between two time series from a quasar. It's called reverberation mapping. But what I'm going to be talking about today is I know that a lot of the work going on in FOCI is to do with some pretty messy and sometimes high dimensional posteriors. So this is just going to be an overview of what pre-built tools do you have access to in NumPyro and what is the difference between them and when would you want to use one over the other? Because 90% of the time you're going to use HMC because it's the shiny new tool. And can say that at least a couple, I know for a fact, at least some of the people in this call have found themselves shedding a lot of tears over making that decision and falling foul of the quite significant limitations of HMC. So, obviously, preaching to the choir here, but Bayesian analysis is good. We like it. It lets you evaluate, it lets you sample from a posterior and build up a picture of parameter constraints, even in cases where an exhaustive search of the parameter space would be completely intractable. The thing that delineates between different types of MCMC is how you wander around parameter space. You've got some posterior you're trying to map out. Once you've made it onto it, you're at some position, you have a proposal of where you want to go next. And then by analogy of energy, it's like going up and down between high and low energy states. If you go to a lower energy state, which is higher probability, then you always make that transition. But if you want to go the other way and fall to a high energy, low probability, then you need to like absorb energy from the environment, and that has a certain chance of occurring. And so there's some probabilistic de-weighting that you go downhill as opposed to uphill. And if you let a chain cook like this, like with the basic Metropolis-Hastings method, which is where your proposal is just some Gaussian envelope centered on your position, then that chain will eventually wander around and map out parameter space. Great. This probably isn't new to any of you. Now, the problem is that the Metropolis-Hastings method is not very efficient in high dimensions. As you move up to even a dozen dimensions, the probability that your proposal will be any good just drops off very, very quickly. You can shrink the proposal window, but then you travel really slowly, and so you have to use a lot more samples. Um, have to use a lot more samples to map out the posterior. So we have fancy advanced methods that are developed over the last 100 years or so. In NumPyro, you've basically got 6 tools at your disposal. Your yeah, uh, ranging from the simplest ones that are really just tweaks of Metropolis Hastings, all the way up to the shiny sports car that is Hamiltonian Monte Carlo. And very broadly, you can think of these as ranging from simple but robust to advanced and really fast, but quite easy to break. Uh, if you spent much time in NumPy, you'll know that the beauty of using these is it really is as simple as swapping out one line. When you're constructing your MCMC sampler, you just say, hey, I'd like to use this algorithm, please. You change out this one line here, and you have access to about these 5 different things here. So starting with the golden child, The most popular one is Hamiltonian Monte Carlo. I said before we have that you can think of MCMC through that analogy of moving through energy levels at different states. HMC just extends that to include kinetic energy. Walkers don't just have a energy from their position, they've also got a kinetic energy. The slope of that potential provides forces, and the walker sort of just rolls around parameter space like a steel ball, occasionally getting kicks to its energy and direction so that it travels randomly. Now, the advantage of this is it's really efficient in high dimensions. By leveraging the gradients, you have more information about the shape of the posterior, can handle very complicated geometry quite well, things that are non-Gaussian. It's just very fast, very effective. But it does have some failing modes we'll get to in a moment. Most notably, it completely fails if you've got a multimodal distribution. If I've got two pits in my potential function, and I've got a steel ball in one of them, it is very unlikely that it'll have enough energy to get over to the other location. So HMC is really bad in that case. The next one down the chain is what's called Barker Metropolis Hastings, which is just a slight tweak to Metropolis Hastings where you evaluate your gradient where you currently are and use that to skew your proposal distribution. Now, because we've abandoned that kinematic analogy. Instead of a ball rolling around, it's more like the puddle jumping that you get from Metropolis Hastings, so it's a lot more robust. It's a lot harder to get stuck on walls or snagged on anything. But you're still using gradients to get better performance. So this isn't as good as HMC, but it's more likely to converge if you've got, for example, like a little wall in your potential function. Barker M8 can sort of tunnel through it because it just samples on either side and goes through with no trouble. The other thing NumPyro's got is it's got an implementation of the affine invariant ensemble sampler. So if you haven't used NumPyro and you've just used MC, this is that algorithm. It's also got a variant of it that uses slice sampling instead of the regular rejection sampling, which scales better into higher dimensions. And the sample adaptive sampler, which is the bottom of the barrel, the closest thing you have to brute force. But this thing is eventually unconditionally convergent, at least as far as I know. This just works by keeping track of a whole bunch of whole bunch of points from your chain, drawing a Gaussian around them, and saying, okay, my posterior probably looks like my current distribution of points. I'll make my proposal from there. And so slowly it learns the distribution. You can see here we've got a non-Gaussian posterior, and here is its best but conservative guess for what that posterior looks like, and the blue points are then being drawn from there and then accepted or rejected based on the actual probability. So to test how well these work, aside from high dimensions, which are hard to give good examples for, there are three ways that you might break a sampler. Multimodal distribution, a highly non-Gaussian distribution, or one that looks pretty clean in the likelihood distribution, but in the log likelihood, it's got this sort of noise down here. So in a lot of applications where you've got aliasing, you'll have a likelihood function that looks like this. In fact, in reverberation mapping, this is one of the problems. Whenever you've got two measurements that line up in a light curve, if they disagree with each other, at that lag, you get a massive dip in your likelihood function, which creates these really deep hits in the potential. So, hang on, there must be shapes here that haven't shown up. So how well do the different samplers perform here? Well, the general rule of thumb is the more you rely on gradients, the more likely you are to break in multimodality. Samplers can sort of be broadly grouped into ones that learn the posterior through an ensemble of points, and ones that get a lot of information about your specific point in the chain-based and ensemble-based. And things that don't keep track of the ensemble fail with multimodal distributions. So here we've got these four different islands, and HMC and nuts cannot move between them. It's just absolutely atrocious. If you ran this thing many, many times over, you'd find that it would sort of congregate on the islands evenly because it doesn't have any way to actually compare between them or travel between them. It's got very poor mixing. Same goes for Barker MH because, again, it's a chain-based method, not an ensemble-based method. Meanwhile, the ugly, crude method that just samples blindly without any gradient, this thing converges completely fine, though it's a little bit choppier. If you wanted good results, you'd have to run this for a bit longer. So, uh, whereas, sorry, I said before that you've got MC or the Athena variant ensemble sampler. This also fails with multimodal distributions. You can see here it's not done a particularly good job. Uh, Meanwhile, its cousin that uses size sampling, this particular implementation also has some clever clustering under the hood, so it can handle multimodal distributions. Non-Gaussianity, obviously any MCMC sampler worth its salt can handle non-Gaussianity pretty well. Up into higher dimensions, this becomes a little bit less true, but all of these are working more or less fine. I've run these with basically the same computational cost on all of them, and this is a good A/B test of the efficiency of the sampler. You can see nuts out of the non-fancy samplers is getting probably the cleanest contours, whereas sample adapted is getting really choppy ones. So why would you want to use these less advanced methods? Well, something that breaks pretty easily is in that case before where I said you had noise. Hang on, that's what's happened. So in that case where your posterior looks fine, but in your log likelihood function, it's actually very, very easy to break a lot of these. In this one here, if I go back to what the log likelihood function looks like, this landscape here is the thing that the sampler is actually trying to navigate through. And if you've got these channels, they create walls of potential that HMC can't move through. And so the chain here, if you can see on this contour plot, it's basically stuck in a valley and can't move left or right. And I should stress, this is not a contrived example that I've made up just to break this thing. This is actually a problem I had in my research. Uh, I had a particular parameter that had these deep uh, valleys in the posterior distribution, and HMC would not move whatsoever. Meanwhile, cruder things like sample adaptive, it hasn't worked in this case because I didn't get time to run it for long enough. This eventually would work, while some of the other fancier samplers have just completely broken. This again is that sliding scale of you get things that are really fast and really fancy, or ones that will, in general, work even if you beat them through some messy posteriors. So that's what I've got here. Like I said, I put this together more as a overview of the tools you've got at your disposal rather than a full overview of my research. Um, do we have any questions about that? I have some other notes lying around I can go through if you'd like.
My quick question is what's your favorite sampler?
I am a big fan of Polychord right now because I met Will Hadley last week.
Nice. And
So
which sampler was that? Sorry, Polychord.
Polychord. So it's something I didn't get a chance to put together. Let me just pull something else out. How do I close that? And here we go. Something I didn't get a chance to put together here. There is another thing. If you don't want to use MCMC, there is always nested sampling. Now, nested sampling can vary a lot between different implementations. For example, Shashank will be able to tell you that the NumPyro built-in nested sampler at Jackson's can be a little bit fragile at times and a bit temperamental. But Polychord, for example, can fit these multimodal distributions with that low-level noise really quite robustly and quite efficiently. Now, this comes at the cost of having a lot more evaluations to get you nice, clean parameter constraint contours. But the same things that make nested sampling a good integrator, the ability to explore parameter space quite broadly and thoroughly, also make it very good for doing MCMC-like chains in the case of complicated posteriors like this. The only thing you need to be aware of, though, is at least with Jackson S, sorry, when you've got a lot of complicated stuff in the low likelihood regime, it can take a while for it to learn the posterior before sampling properly further on. Favorite sampler? Probably nested sampling right now.
Nice. Awesome. So what's the because yeah, I've never used nested samplers before myself, and I'm not very familiar with the conceptual difference beyond the idea that like yeah, it handles multimodal things better. Like yeah, I guess I'm curious as to how nested sampling is able to sort of find those solutions. Do you need to sort of initialize it around those points? Yeah, if you
Um,
could talk a little bit about that, I'd be very curious.
so luckily I have notes for this as well. Uh, the idea of nested sampling is it's a clever trick of using sort of fractally nested uh, estimates of the average likelihood over parameter space to slowly build up the integral. The basic idea behind it is you start by throwing down a whole bunch of live points distributed evenly across the posterior. Like it's really important that they have to be uniformly distributed. Then you remove the worst of them and uniformly draw another point that is better from the region that is uphill. So what that does is suppose you've got 100 life points. If you kill one of them and replace it, well, then the region that those points subtend has shrunk by 1% because you've removed 1 point and gotten a better one. So if your initial volume was, 1, then the volume that your points are over now is 99%, is 0.99. Do that again, 0.98, and so forth, and it exponentially contracts. But because you know the average, you know the likelihood, basically the height of the function with those points, as you shrink in, you've got estimates of how big these plates are, and also an estimate of how tall they are, and that lets you build up this integral as you go across. Now, with some clever, that's why nested sampling is an integrator rather than a sampler. But with some clever reweighting, you can take the points that you use to do that integration and get something that looks like a nested sampling chain out of it. Get something that looks like an MCMC chain out of it. The complexity of nested sampling is that part where when you remove the old point and replace it with a new one, that is a deceptively complicated problem, which is why there's a lot of work going on in how to do that efficiently in high dimensions and with many shapes.
Yeah, so does the nested samplers struggle in higher dimensions then? Like, can they also just like fail silently where they don't find a particular you know, distribution
They
if you
can?
yeah, if you don't have enough sample points or whatnot?
Absolutely, yeah. So if I can get a good picture of this actually. Um, I have that's like polychord. Orbital will. Here we go. So polychord is one of the most popular nested samplers, and it's a little bit like sample adaptive, the sample adaptive sampler, where it uses some set of live points. Actually, sorry, no, we want, just give me a moment here. There we are. So this is like the JAX NS. It's the one that plugs directly into NumPyro. What it does is it takes your current set of life points, that's the ones that you're using to estimate the contours, and it breaks that up into a bunch of Gaussian ellipsoids and said, this is a good guess of what the contour looks like here. So if you're unlucky, it's entirely possible there could be some other part of this contour that you are missing and never drew a thing around. There are some common sense tricks you can use to check the diagnostics, like most obvious one, run the algorithm twice and see if the answer changes a lot. You can tell pretty easily whether you've got like a numerical, like have you run this thing long enough to get good convergence and all of that. But it's a bit like optimization. You don't know if there's a peak that you never saw a priori. So yeah, there are failure modes.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So do nested samplers then struggle worse in higher dimensions if they've, because you're sort of setting those random points and trying to find places, like if a high dimensional problem that sort of spanning that space efficiently is going to be much harder, right?
It is. So nested sampling is sort of you can sort of think of it as a mid ground between just line Monte Carlo integration and MCMC, speaking very roughly. Yes, they have worse dimensional scaling than the best available MCMC. That slice sampling trick that I mentioned with ESS, most nested samplers will use that because that scales particularly well into high dimensions. But even that solution only goes so far.
Yeah, cool.
But the nested sampling gives you the evidence with which traditional MCMC samplers don't, right? That's the big difference with
Yeah,
with nested sampling, right?
yeah. So nested sampling is strictly it's an integrator. It's just that it can be sort of bootstrapped into a parameter constrainer as well. It's just that the same things that make it a good integrator also make it a pretty robust explorer of parameter space.
And that's helpful for like model comparison and stuff like that, right? For comparing two different models. Yeah. I had a question on the MCMC as well.
Mhm.
So most of the tests for HMC, honestly, most of these examples that I see code packages subject themselves to tend to be in two dimensions, maybe three if you're lucky. So they really break, like some of these really break in higher dimensions, and you don't really know that. So like, is there a good test in higher dimensions for these samplers to see which ones are expected to break first when you go up in dimensions?
That's a good question. And in fact, as far as I know, HMC is convergent up to any reasonable number of dimensions, where reasonable number is quite large. But the Affine invariant sampler, which is MC, that actually fails surprisingly early. If you've got 100 parameters, it does not properly recover the mean and covariance of even a simple distribution. There's a paper by this that came out a couple of years ago. I've got it sitting in my stack somewhere. Uh, as I understand it, the general rule of thumb is that if you're using gradients, your ability to scale into high dimensions gets much better. But at a certain point, it's not a question of efficiency. It's a question of whether you're going to converge to the right point at all.
Yeah, I think David Hogg I was talking to, and he was saying that sort of 2 to 3 dimensions is grid search. 3 to sort of 1 to 2 dozen is like affine samplers, and then anything beyond that is you need gradients to be able to actually to recover the correct value. Yeah, because the affine ones will silently break in high dimensions because you don't have that potential. So it looks like it's converging, but it actually hasn't sampled the space correctly, and will be like, yeah, look at this good answer, and then you go and publish something, and it's it's converged to the wrong value.
Oh, the other thing you need to be aware of is non-gradient samplers often have edge effects. Like
Oh,
with MC, if your contour is meant to be flat and then there's a wall because your prior stops, the samples sort of bounce off and bunch up over here, and you get this bump that you don't actually want to be there.
that's
Gradient stuff, you sort of just shimmy around.
Yeah, that's actually quite interesting. So they like naturally they'll like reflect a point about the boundary points.
Yeah, yeah, because so the way MC works is you choose 2 points, draw a chord between them, and then along that line you slingshot some third point. And if that thing gets slingshot and then lands outside the prior, just lands
Mm.
outside, then that point's going to get rejected, and you're going to get an extra point in your chain when you started, which will be necessarily near the edge. And so you sort
Yeah,
of build up these rejected samples there.
yeah, cool. All right. Do we have any other questions for Hugh or?
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at this. This stuff looks like this. I think work of Ferrar's was trying to add neural network predictability to the choice of the next active point in a nested chain, if I remember. So is this dynamic nested sampling, this new one you've got here? Would this count as a dynamic nested sampler, like Dynasty or any of those?
Jackson's?
Yeah.
Jackson, sorry. No, I think Jackson S is static. I could be wrong on that.
Or is it a neural
But
network predictive for the next point?
no, Jackson S doesn't use that. So dynamic nested sampling is where it's a bit like variable step size in a n-body simulator. It's just where you
Yeah.
crank up the tolerances on the parts that matter. Uh, JAX-NS uses a mix of multi-nests Gaussian ellipsoids and polychord slice sampling.
Yeah.
And other than that, it's very traditional. I know that there are some
Yeah.
new ones. I think
I've
Nautilus
always
uses
wondered
neural nets.
why you don't put, say, the stretch move inside the nested sampler to choose, or even HMC inside a nested algorithm. And I was told by Brendan Brewer that had been tried and it didn't work. And I don't know why, but
I was actually talking to Will Handley about this last week because he was visiting UQ. The problem, I think, is that you need to sample uniformly from within that plate. And MCMC, by its nature, is used for navigating hills, right? If you try to wander around a flat plate, you're in trouble.
no, I disagree. I mean, HMC is going around. I mean, orbits go around equipotentials, and that's perfectly what you want, right? You want to go around an equipotential in a nested. You don't want to go to the summit, and you don't want to go down to the trough. You want something the same as the point you removed. And HMCs just dial it up. That's what it does, right? So I never quite understood why HMC wasn't putting, sorry, why nested people weren't putting HMC in there. In the guts of their machine, but apparently it doesn't work, and I never quite got that.
Um, well, the slice sampling that they use in Jackson S and Polychord, that is still a Markov chain. It's just not in the same sense as MCMC.
It's it's a very dumb Markov chain, right? It's
You need to do a couple of slices to decorrelate yourself from where you started.
yeah,
But
usually it takes several steps, but it's a particularly drunk version where um you want it to walk well. If you select the point at random, you want it to walk downhill just as much as uphill. So you don't want MCMC there. But yeah, you have a different rejection criteria. Usually it's got to be better than the worst point you're about to throw away, right? That's what you do each loop.
yeah, but
Yeah.
then very importantly, it has to be completely unbiased about where it goes next. So it has to be uncorrelated from all of your other points in the chain, except to be of higher likelihood, uniformly distributed. Like you don't want to draw higher likelihood points
That's
preferentially.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess the point is that intrinsically it spends more time in lower regions of probability than a yeah, if exploring a compact parameter space is what you want to do, then it's never going to be competitive with a HMC or Monte Carlo technique.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The joy of nested sampling is it tells you where the likelihood isn't, which is just as necessary for an integral as knowing where it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Anyway,
Cool.
everyone should watch my lecture notes. You can.
Yeah, I still haven't done your MLDI course.
What's that?
Still haven't done your MLDI course.
You have, yeah, Louis. You'd be
You
asking.
should send your
Gotta
lecture
teach
notes
it.
to us.
What's that? Sorry.
You should send them like as an email or
The
Slack or something.
university puts it all behind paywalls and stuff.
Yeah.
So it sounds bad. I mean, yes, the problem is that it's all packaged into this thing, and I can't add you as an auditor unless you've got a university. Have you got a uni key, a Sydney uni key? No, you probably
I
don't.
don't think so. No.
Anyone who's got a Sydney uni key, I can add you. And Grace is added, so just ask Grace for her password. It'll be fine. That'll be fine, right, Grace? Post it in the Slack.
Yeah, I trust you.
Maybe not.
Cool. Yeah, so do we have any more questions for Hugh? If not, then we'll sure give Hugh a nice thank you. Little applause. Yeah, that was very, very informative. I'm sure that quite a few people in here are probably going to come back and reference this when they come and have new problems to approach. I know I'm going to be looking into doing some sampling quite soon. Yeah, so actually, if you could pass on those slides, and you also have a little blog series that sort of covers a lot of this stuff as well, with more detail that you quickly flashed up. So I'll just plug that to people, and I'll take this recording, upload it with all the links there, so people can come and reference this if they need in the future. Yeah, so thank you again, Hugh, and I will pause this recording.